Last May 25th, the Sunday New York Times published an article entitled Superhighway to Bliss about Jill Bolt Taylor, a neuroscientist who suffered a massive stroke in 1996. After she regained the ability to speak, she described the experience as nirvana. The next day, the piece was #1 on the New York Times list of most emailed articles. The next day, in the Science Times section of the paper the following Tuesday, there was an article entitled Lotus Therapy about the growing use of the meditation cushion to treat problems previously consigned to the analyst's couch. The next day, Lotus Therapy had taken over the top spot as the most emailed article. 2 weeks earlier, David Brooks had entitled his op-ed piece, The Neural Buddhists. The casual reader of the New York Times during the month of May last spring would likely have noticed this and wondered why all the interest in Buddhism and science all of a sudden. Anyone working in the field of Buddhist studies would have been noticing this interest, at least out of the corner of the eye, for some years now. In my own case, I'd originally imagined it was yet another appropriation of Buddhism by the New Age, another product of the 1970s, gaining its popular expression in Fritjof Capra's 1975 bestseller, The Tao of Physics. It turned out I was both right and wrong. The claims did derive from the 70s, but I was off by a century. Statements about the compatibility of Buddhism and science go back to the 1870s. The nature of this compatibility has fallen across a wide spectrum, with some suggesting that the essential teachings of Buddhism, variously identified, are in no way contradicted by the findings of science, variously enumerated, while others suggest that the Buddha himself anticipated many of the key discoveries of science, that the Buddha knew more than 2 millennia in the past what scientists would only discover 2 millennia in the future. This afternoon, I would like to examine briefly the origins of such claims, identify some of their present manifestations, and consider what is at stake in the conjunction of Buddhism and science. Prior to the 19th century, European scholars divided the peoples of the world into 4 nations: Christians, Jews, Mohammedans, and idolaters. The Buddhists encountered across Asia by European explorers, travelers, and Roman Catholic missionaries were placed in this last category, and statues of the Buddha were regarded as idols. It was only in the 19th century that the Buddha was identified with certainty as a historical figure of Indian origin, no longer a stone idol, but the founder of a great world religion. European travelers encountered Buddhism all over Asia, but not in India, the land of the Buddha's birth. By the 14th century, Buddhism had all but disappeared from India. The reasons for its disappearance are complex, but the consequences were profound. For by the 19th century, when European scholars trained in South Asian languages began a sustained study of the culture and history of India, what they would come to call Buddhism was an artifact. There were no Buddhists in India, although there were Buddhists almost everywhere else in Asia. Instead, India had monuments, often in ruins, cave temples overgrown by jungle, and statues often broken. There were stone inscriptions to be deciphered. There were Sanskrit manuscripts preserved in Nepal to the north, and Pali manuscripts preserved in Sri Lanka to the south. These were the materials from which European philologists would build their Buddhism. The 19th century thus saw the birth of what the Jesuit historian Henri de Lubac has called the scientific discovery of Buddhism. That is, the study of Buddhism by scholars who could read Buddhist texts in the original. This was made possible by significant advances in the science of philology, with the discovery of language families and ancient connections between the classical language of Sanskrit in India and the classical European languages of Greek and Latin, as well as modern German, French, and English. These were called at the time the Indo-European languages, or the Aryan languages. Aryan is a Sanskrit term meaning noble or superior. Through a complicated process, theories of language groups eventually gave rise to theories of racial groups. The kinship between the people of ancient India and the people of ancient Greece, and through a certain leap of faith to those of modern Europe, became not simply a matter of verb roots, but of bloodlines. Because there were no Buddhists in India during the colonial period, The Buddhism of India, that is, the first Buddhism, became the domain of European and later American and then Japanese scholars. In 1844, the French Sanskritist Eugène Burnouf argued convincingly that Buddhism is an Indian religion and that it must be understood first through texts in Indian languages. For the remainder of the 19th century, India became the primary focus of Buddhist studies in Europe, and Sanskrit, together with Pali, became the lingua franca of the academic field. Much of the early scholarship focused on the life of the Buddha and on the early history of Buddhism in India prior to its demise there, and it was referred to by terms such as original Buddhism, primitive Buddhism, and even pure Buddhism. This austere system of ethics and philosophy stood in sharp contrast to what was perceived as the spiritual and sensuous exoticism of colonial India, where Buddhism was long dead. This ancient Buddhism, derived from the textual studies of scholars in the libraries of Europe, could be regarded as the authentic form of this great religion against which the various Buddhisms of 19th century Asia could be measured and generally found to be both derivative and adulterated. Buddhism thus came to be regarded as a tradition that resided most authentically in its texts, such that it could be effectively studied from the libraries of Europe. Many of the great scholars of the 19th century never traveled to Asia at all. They created a Buddha and a Buddhism unknown at the time in Asia, and that may never have existed there before the late 19th century. Just as there was a quest for the historical Jesus, there was a quest for the historical Buddha, and European Orientalists felt that they had found him. This Buddha was not so foreign. In fact, he was racially an Aryan, unique among the founders of the world religions. Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad were all Semites. But the nobility of the prince who had renounced his kingdom was not only hereditary. The Buddha had famously rejected the idea of inherited nobility of the Indian caste system, claiming the nobility that derived instead from wisdom. He thus called his first teaching the Four Truths for the Noble, the Aryan. This is a term often translated as the Four Noble Truths. Indeed, this Buddha was doubly noble. He was noble by birth, by blood, and by language, but yet he was also noble because he renounced his royal birth to achieve a spiritual nobility. In language that was often overtly anti-clerical, he was portrayed as a great reformer, described by some as the Luther of Asia, who condemned the vapid priestcraft of the Brahmins and the caste system they controlled. In a Europe obsessed with questions of race and questions of humanity, the Buddha was both racially superior and a savior for all humanity, an ancient kinsman, a modern hero. Furthermore, his ancient teachings, as represented by Victorian scholars, seemed most modern. Buddhism, then, could be hailed as a religion whose founder was neither a god nor a prophet of God, but a man. This man, through his own efforts and his own investigations, discovered the nature of the universe and then compassionately taught it to others. This Buddha described a universe that was not created by God, but that functioned according to laws of cause and effect. These laws were not limited to the material world, but extended also to the moral realm, where virtue leads eventually to happiness and sin to suffering, not through the whims of a capricious God, but through the natural law of karma. This Buddha understood the mechanisms of the mind in precise detail, explaining how desire, hatred, and ignorance motivate actions that eventually result in all manner of physical and mental pain. And he set forth techniques for bringing the chattering mind and the unruly emotions under control in order to achieve a state of serenity. Beyond this, he analyzed the myriad constituents that together are called the person, finding among them nothing that lasts longer than an instant. Thus, he discovered through his analysis that there is no self, that there is no soul, that what we call the person is but a psychophysical process. This Buddha then extended his analysis to the phenomena of the universe, declaring the universal truth of praticca samuppada, dependent origination, according to which everything is interrelated, each entity connected to something, nothing standing alone, with effects depending on their causes, wholes depending on their parts, and everything depending on the mind that perceives it, appearing differently depending upon one's perspective. Yet, whether wave or particle, there is no uncertainty about the ultimate nature of reality, which the Buddha called shunyata, or emptiness. This Buddha's discoveries were not limited to psychological truths and philosophical insights. He described multiple universes, each with its own sun, universes that arose out of nothingness and returned to nothingness over the course of vast cosmic phases of creation, abiding, destruction, and nothingness, measured in massive units of time called countless aeons. And he explained how countless beings are born in these universes across these aeons, each moving through a process of spiritual evolution to a state of perfect wisdom. This Buddha discovered these truths not through revelation, but through investigation and analysis, testing hypotheses in the laboratory of his mind to arrive at proofs. He articulated these truths in his teachings, truths that derive not from faith, but from the Buddha's own experience. And when he died, he did not ascend into heaven. He lay down between two trees and said to his monks, quote, "All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence." And then he passed away like a flame going out. For Europeans and Americans seeking an alternative to theistic religions, who sought to preserve religion, or at least a religion, in the light of science, this was a Buddha to whom all manner of scientific insights could be ascribed, from the mechanisms of the universe to the structure of the atom, from a natural law of morality to the deepest workings of the mind. His was a religion, if a religion at all, that required no dogma, no faith, no divinely inspired scriptures, no ritual, no worship of images, no God. This led many European enthusiasts to declare Buddhism as the religion most suited to serious dialogue with science. Both the Buddha and science postulated immutable laws that govern the universe. But this Buddha was rather different from the Buddha whose words were recited and whose image was venerated across Asia. Despite the chronological and geographical range of the tradition, the Buddha was portrayed with great consistency in Asia. He was believed to have perfected himself over the course of millions of lifetimes as a bodhisattva, performing the virtuous deeds called perfections. He was believed to have taken rebirth in heaven in his penultimate life, where he perused the world to select the city of his final birth, his caste, his clan, his parents. He was believed to have achieved enlightenment at the age of 35, sitting under a tree along the banks of a river. With this enlightenment, he was believed to possess all manner of supernormal powers, including full knowledge of each of his own past lives and those of all other beings, the ability to know others' thoughts, the ability to create doubles of himself, the ability to rise into the air and simultaneously shoot fire and water from his body. And it was an extraordinary body, endowed with the 32 marks of a Superman, including 40 teeth, webbed fingers, the signs of wheels on the soles of his feet, and a crown protrusion on the top of his head. Although he passed into nirvana at the age of 81, he could have lived for an aeon or until the end of the aeon, had he only been asked to do so. Rather than narrating the events of his final lifetime, the traditional biographies of the Buddha, which did not begin to appear until some 4 centuries after his death, seem more intent on describing his previous lives and the previous Buddhas he had encountered along the way. The concern there seemed not to be the portrayal of the Buddha's individuality and his humanity, but his identity with other Buddhas said to have come in the distant past and who were prophesied to come in the future. He was but one of many Buddhas. He was the 4th, or the 7th, or the 25th. Each taught the same truth, the same path of liberation from suffering. There were indeed elaborate descriptions of the Buddha's final birth, but they appeared centuries after his death. And even there, it was his continuity with the Buddhas of epochs past, rather than his unique character, that provided the foundation of his authority. Indeed, all Buddhas are said to be remarkably similar in word and deed. They differ from each other in just a few ways, one of which is the circumference of their aura. The Buddha who'd been created in Europe did not remain there long. By the latter half of the 19th century, much of Buddhist Asia had come under European control. Ceylon and Burma were British colonies. Indochina was a French colony. Although China, Korea, Japan, and Tibet did not come under direct European or American control, they each had varying levels of contact with Europe including the establishment of Christian missions. As in the classical colonial economy, raw materials, in this case Buddhist texts in Sanskrit and Pali, were extracted from the colony and shipped to Europe, where they were refined to produce a new Buddha, one that had not existed before. And to complete the colonial circuit, that Buddha was then exported back to Asia, where he was sold to Asian Buddhists who sent him into battle against the Christians. Christian missionaries to Asia continued to regard Buddhists as heathens and sought to demonstrate the errors of Buddhism, sometimes condemning it as superstition, sometimes as idolatry. To counter these claims, Buddhist leaders argued that Buddhism was in fact superior to Christianity, in part because it was more compatible with science. At a lecture delivered in the town hall in New York in 1925, the Sinhalese activist Anakata Dharmapala declared, quote, "The message of the Buddha that I have to bring to you is free from theology, priestcraft, rituals, ceremonies, dogmas, heavens, hells, and other theological shibboleths. The Buddha taught to the civilized Aryans of India 25 centuries ago a scientific religion containing the highest individualistic, altruistic ethics, a philosophy of life built on psychological mysticism and a cosmogony which is in harmony with geology, astronomy, radioactivity, and relativity. No creator God can create an ever-changing, ever-existing cosmos. Countless billions of aeons ago, the Earth was existing but undergoing change, and there are billions of solar systems that had existed and exist and shall exist." In China, the challenge came not only from Christian missionaries, but from a growing community of Chinese intellectuals who saw Buddhism as one of several forms of primitive superstition preventing China's entry into the modern world. For them, Buddhist practice was fraught with ghosts and demons, and Buddhist doctrine was life-denying. As a religion imported from India long ago, Buddhism had periodically been regarded with suspicion by the state over the course of Chinese history and had been subjected to imperial persecution on 4 occasions. Criticism of Buddhism intensified in the early decades of the 20th century, especially after the Republican Revolution of 1911, when Buddhism was denounced by both Christian missionaries and by Chinese students who returned from studying abroad, for whom the works of John Dewey and Karl Marx were particularly popular. Again, the new Buddha was sent into battle. In a lecture published in 1928, the Chinese monk Taishu not only saw Buddhism as compatible with modern science, but superior to it. And I quote, "Buddhism holds that science does not go far enough into the mysteries of nature, and that if she went further, the Buddhist doctrine would be even more evident. The truths contained in the Buddhist doctrine concerning the real nature of the universe would greatly help science and tend to bring about a union between science and Buddhism." End quote. In the last decades of the 19th century, Buddhism was also under attack in Japan. In an effort to demonstrate the relevance of Buddhism to the larger interests of the Japanese state, Buddhist leaders sought to promote a new Buddhism that would play an active role in Japan's attempts to modernize and expand. In the early years of the Meiji period, which began in 1868, Buddhism was portrayed as a foreign and anachronistic institution, riddled with corruption, a parasite on society, a purveyor of superstition, impeding Japan from taking its rightful place among the great nations of the modern world. The new Buddhism that was espoused in response to such charges was represented as purely Japanese and purely Buddhist, more Buddhist in fact than the other Buddhisms of Asia, especially those of China and Korea, which many Japanese Buddhist leaders conceded were in fact corrupt. The new Buddhism was also committed to social welfare, urging the foundation of public education, hospitals, and charities. It supported the military expansion of the Japanese Empire, and it was fully consistent with modern science. This consistency was claimed by many Japanese Buddhist thinkers, including D.T. Suzuki, who would later become renowned in the West for his books on Zen. But in his first major work, Outlines of Mahayana Buddhism, published in 1907, Suzuki's concerned not with Zen, but with Buddhism as a universal religion, and he sets forth its correspondence to science. Quote, "It is wonderful that Buddhism clearly anticipated the outcome of modern psychological researches at the time when all other religions and philosophical systems were eagerly cherishing dogmatic superstitions concerning the nature of the ego. The refusal of modern psychology to have the soul mean anything more than the sum total of all mental experiences, such as sensations, ideas, feelings, decisions, etc., is precisely a rehearsal of the Buddhist doctrine of no self." End quote. Although these and other authors each offered a somewhat different view from the other, together they regard Buddhism as that religion most compatible with science, although they also hold that Buddhism offers access to states of wisdom that science alone can never attain. Some even went so far to declare that Buddhism was not a religion at all, but was itself a science of the mind. The implications of such a claim become clear in the light of theories of social evolution of the day, which saw an inevitable advance of humanity from the state of primitive superstition to religion and then to science. As a science, Buddhism, condemned as a superstition both by European missionaries and by Asian modernists, jumped from the bottom of the evolutionary scale to the top, bypassing the troublesome category of religion altogether. The discourse of Buddhism and science remained relatively dormant during the 1940s and 50s, with the exception of parallels drawn by some between psychoanalysis and Zen, inspired largely by the works of Deity Suzuki. It reemerged in the 1960s with the efflorescence of interest in Asian religions and Eastern wisdom. The signal publication during this period was the improbable bestseller, The Tao of Physics, first published in 1975. It went on to become a classic of the New Age, selling more than 1 million copies. Its author, Fritjof Capra, was a physicist rather than a student of Buddhism, and thus relied on secondary sources for his portrayal of Buddhist thought. As was the case of many works of the period, Capra spoke as often of Eastern mysticism as of a specific tradition. This mysticism included for him insight from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Like the theosophists of the 19th century, Capra saw a deep foundation from which all mystical traditions arise, a tradition that both anticipates and is confirmed by what he called the new physics. Both mysticism and modern physics derive their insights from empirical methods, yet those insights cannot be expressed in words. Thus, they remain beyond the comprehension of those who are neither mystics nor physicists. Since the 1980s, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet has been the most visible and influential Buddhist teacher to embrace the discourse of Buddhism and science. The figures of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such as Dharmapala, Taishu, and Deity Suzuki, had complicated and in some cases strained relations with the Buddhist institutions of their homelands, and none had either the authority or the stature of the Dalai Lama. Born in 1935 in a distant corner of the Tibetan cultural domain, he displayed an interest in mechanical things from the time of his tutelage in the Potala Palace, where he discovered various European gadgets that had been given as gifts to his predecessor. The People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet in 1950, and the Dalai Lama assumed the position of head of state, traveling in 1954 to China, where he was impressed by Chinese feats of engineering. During a failed uprising against the occupying army in March 1959, he escaped to India, where he has lived ever since. The Dalai Lama made his first trip to the United States in 1979 and has traveled extensively since then, often meeting with scientists and researchers to discuss a wide range of topics, from cosmology to neurology. Due in part to his interests, over the past 20 years, the effects of Buddhist meditation have begun to be measured by neurologists, adding a new dimension to the Buddhism and science discourse. Rather than pointing to affinities between particular Buddhist doctrines and particular scientific theories, research on meditation has sought to calculate the physiological and neurological effects of Buddhist meditation. Such research would seem to introduce a welcome empirical element to the Buddhism and science conversation. Indeed, the assertions being made in this domain are qualitatively different from the assertion that the Buddha understood the theory of relativity. The claim here is that Buddhist meditation works. However, to understand the laboratory findings, such a claim requires that one first identify what is Buddhist about this meditation, describe what the term meditation encompasses in this case, and explain finally what works means, especially in the context of the exalted goals that have traditionally been ascribed to Buddhist practice. Although these goals are numerous and variously identified across the tradition, it can be said that their ultimate goal is not self-help, but a radical reorientation toward the world, and in many articulations, a liberation from it, either for oneself or for all beings. Through these various peregrinations, the discourse of Buddhism and science has survived from the 19th through the 20th and now into the 21st century. It began in the arena of polemics, with Buddhists seeking to defend their religion against the attacks of Christian missionaries. By the time that the first claims of affinity between Buddhism and science began to be made in Asia in the late 19th century, science had come to carry connotations of authority, validation, and truth, separate from, and in some cases in conflict with, those of the Christian Church. It is therefore perhaps unsurprising that Buddhist leaders in Asia would point to what they identified as the scientific aspects of Buddhism in an effort to trump the charges of idolatry and superstition leveled at them by Christian missionaries across the Buddhist world. They argued that the Buddha knew long ago what the science of the Christian West was only now discovering, whether it be the mechanisms of causation that rely on no God, the analysis of experiences into their component parts, the subtle disintegration of matter called impermanence, or the existence of multiple worlds. In this first stage, Buddhism was the philosophy of the Buddha, as European Orientalists understood him, an aristocratic teacher who rebelled against the corrupt priestcraft of his day to teach an ethical system that required no God, which opened the path to freedom from suffering to all men. Asian Buddhists and European enthusiasts could thus claim Buddhism as the most modern of the world religions, able to uphold morality without the need for an angry creator God, and as the most scientific, fully in accord with the science of the day, which described a mechanistic universe of cause and effect. In the period after the Second World War, this science was displaced by Einstein's theories, and original Buddhism was displaced by Zen, especially as set forth by Nichi Suzuki. The focus turned from cause and effect to relativity, and from the law of karma to interdependence, through creative readings of the Gardenist statements on pratitya samutpada, dependent origination. In more recent years, expositions of emptiness and quantum physics have continued, although now drawing on Tibetan interpretations of Indian Buddhist doctrine, with a new element added: the relation of Buddhism to cognitive science, especially through laboratory investigations of the effects of Buddhist meditation on the brain. Thus, in each of its periods of conjunction with science, a different form of Buddhism has been called upon to play its part. Over the century and a half of its association with Buddhism, science has also meant many things. At times, science has meant a method of sober and rational analysis, with the claim that the Buddha employed such a method to arrive at the knowledge of deep truths about inner and outer worlds. At other times, science refers to a specific theory, the mechanistic universe, the theory of evolution, the theory of relativity, the Big Bang, whose antecedents are to be found in Buddhist doctrine. At other times, science has referred to a specific technology, the microscope, the telescope, the spectrometer, that has been used to discover what the Buddha knew without the aid of such instruments. As more precise instruments have been developed over the past century, the claims of the Buddha's knowledge have remained constant. At still other times, science has referred to the manipulation of matter, with dire consequences for humanity unless paired with the compassionate vision of the Buddha. Sometimes the term science is so vague that it becomes like a mantra, a potent sound with no semantic value. The referent of Buddhism and the referent of science have thus changed radically over the course of more than a century, yet the claim for the compatibility of Buddhism and science has continued to be made with a remarkable rhetorical consistency. And in each case, in order for the claim to be made, each term must be radically restricted. Buddhism becomes a single tradition, and within that tradition, an isolated set of elite doctrines and practices, eliminating much of what has been deemed essential, whatever that might be, to the exalted monks and nuns and ordinary lay people who have gone for refuge to the Buddha over the course of more than 2,000 years. Buddhists first encountered science, perhaps ironically, in the guise of Christianity. It It was a superior knowledge, a knowledge that Christianity possessed and Buddhism did not, thus providing yet further proof of the superiority of Christianity, hence a tool of the missionary and a reason for conversion. For example, in 1552, Francis Xavier criticized the Japanese for not knowing that the sun orbits the earth. Later, science would be portrayed as a product of a more generalized European civilization, something that this civilization would take around the world. The vehicle for that journey was colonialism. The modern Buddhists of the late 19th, early 20th centuries thus had good reason to try to claim science for themselves, whether to counter the missionaries' charge that Buddhism was superstition and idolatry, or to counter the colonialist claim that the Asian was prone to fanciful flights of mind and meaningless rituals of body, or to counter both. Science proved the ideal weapon. It was Buddhism, in fact, that was the scientific religion, the religion best suited for modernity throughout the world. It was an Asian, the Buddha, who knew millennia ago what the European was just beginning to discover. This latter point was only made possible, of course, through the strange international network that invented the Buddha as we know him today. A century later, the missionaries have not gone away, but their inroads into Buddhist societies are largely confined to specific times and places of the past. And European colonialism, in its classical form, is dead. Yet the discourse of Buddhism and science persists, unchanged in so many ways. The enemy is slain, the weapon continues to be wielded. Buddhism and science, whatever those terms might mean, are clearly different. So what is it that has sustained their conjunction for so long? In the scientific method, at least in its idealized form, reality or truth, however defined, has not yet been discovered. Hypothesis and experiment are employed to arrive at a truth that is at the time unknown, or at least unverified. That truth can change, and has changed many times over the history of science, with the new truth sometimes refining an old truth, sometimes completely replacing it. The image is one of augmentation and revision, moving toward an ever-receding horizon of omniscience, toward a theory of everything. Over the long and varied development of Buddhist traditions, there remains the shared belief that the nature of reality was discovered long ago by the Buddha, and before him by the Buddhas of the distant past, and that same reality was understood by all Buddhas in its entirety and its fullness. This reality is represented not as something that the Buddha was the first to discover, but that he rediscovered. In a famous metaphor, the Buddha describes a traveler who comes across an ancient path, an ancient city at the end of an ancient path through a great forest, a once great city, now deserted and in ruins. The traveler informs the king, who restores the city to its former glory. The Buddha is that traveler, discovering the same path to enlightenment that the Buddhas of the past had found. Buddhas of the past had found. Thus, in Buddhism, the truth is something that is found, and then lost, and then found again. This is why it is said that the next Buddha does not appear in the world until the teachings of the previous Buddha have been completely forgotten. As long as the path to the city of reality remains passable, and the city itself remains prosperous, there is no reason for repair. But when the city falls into ruins, and the path is overgrown with oblivion, then the path must be cleared again, and the city restored. That is what the Buddhas do again and again over the aeons. In a sense, then, Buddhism is profoundly retrospective, looking to the past to understand the present in order to secure a safe haven from a hazardous future. There is a comfort in the knowledge that the course to that haven has already been clearly charted. There is a comfort in the knowledge that that course has already been safely navigated. There is a comfort in the knowledge that the other shore has already been reached. Science, in a popular representation, offers a different appeal, an appeal to the quest for what has never been known by anyone, yet is somehow there, waiting to be discovered, if we just knew how to find it. In the meantime, we must live in doubt of our deepest knowledge. Perhaps this is why we yearn for the teachings of an itinerant mendicant in Iron Age India, even if such profound insight to somehow anticipate the formula of Einstein. But the Buddha of Buddhism and science was not born in the Iron Age. He was born in the 19th century. Not in the royal city of Kapilavastu, but in the Republican city of Paris. From there he traveled to Sri Lanka and then to other parts of Asia. A century and a half after his birth, he is alive and well in the imaginations of many, all around the world. But this Buddha is a pale reflection of the Buddha born in Asia, a Buddha who entered our world in order to destroy it. Thus, if an ancient religion like Buddhism has anything to offer science, it is not a facile confirmation of its findings. If we are to seek an analog in Buddhist doctrine, it would be to regard the Buddha created in Europe in the 19th century as one of the many emanation bodies of the Buddha who have appeared in the world, making use of skillful methods to teach a provisional dharma to those temporarily incapable of understanding the true teaching. That teaching, I would argue, is the dharma attributed to the Buddha who existed in Asia before the European discovery of Buddhism, a Buddha who offered a radical critique of the world, including the world described by science. Far from teaching a dharma compatible with Darwin's theory of natural selection, this Buddha was a counter-evolutionary, actively seeking the extinction of the human race, and indeed of all species, through the eradication of the selfish gene. A Tibetan poet wrote these lines in praise of the Buddha. To the sharp weapons of the demons, you offer delicate flowers in return. When the enraged Devadatta pushed down a boulder, you practice silence. Son of the Shakyas, incapable of casting even an angry glance at your enemy, what intelligent person would honor you as protector from fearful samsara? To the sharp weapon of the demons, you offer delicate flowers. This line refers to the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, when Mara, the god of desire and death, dispatched his army of demons against the Buddha, attacking him with a hail of weapons. The Buddha transformed their hail of spears and arrows into a gentle rain of flowers. When the enraged Devadatta pushed down a boulder, you practice silence. This refers to the Buddha's evil cousin, Devadatta, who, seeking to succeed the Buddha as head of the order of monks and nuns, tried to assassinate the Buddha by pushing down a boulder to crush him. The boulder only nicked the Buddha's toe. Devadatta also sent a mad elephant to attack the Buddha, but in neither attack did the Buddha retaliate. Son of the Shakyas, incapable of casting even an angry glance at your enemy, what intelligent person would honor you as protector from fearful samsara? A Buddhist is someone who seeks refuge from suffering in the three jewels: the Buddha, the Dharma, that is the Buddha's teaching, and the Sangha, the community of the enlightened. Here the poet asks, if this is how the Buddha responded to attacks on his own person, what intelligent person? The Tibetan word is loden, perhaps translated better as what person in his or her right mind would look to the Buddha for protection from the myriad sufferings of samsara, the Buddha who would not even defend himself. The poet's suggestion is that the purpose of the Buddha's path is to overturn the ordinary. The poet's implication is that being in one's right mind has been the problem all along. Thus, the Buddha does the opposite of what the world would counsel, setting aside his own welfare in lifetime after lifetime, constantly resisting the demands of self, declaring in fact that there is no self. And as a result of his resistance to what the world regards as wisdom, the Buddha achieved the ultimate state of perfection. The 8th century poet Shantideva wrote of the Buddha, quote, "What need is there to say more? The childish act for their own welfare, the sage acts for the welfare of others. Behold the difference between them." Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. If anyone would like to ask any questions about this talk?
Excuse me. The distinction, the contrast between Buddhism and the science, and yet the total effect of what you were saying before the time was another kind of contrast, and that's a contrast between European Buddhism and Eastern Buddhism, and both are unresolved. Is there a parallelism there?
Well, I guess what I was trying to argue was that there is a Buddha that was created in Europe in some sense and then was exported back to Asia where he has become very popular. And that's the Buddha that has been part of the conversation with science. And so I was trying to make some contrast between that Buddha of the 19th century and the Buddha that we can find in studying Buddhist texts from earlier periods and what was going on in Asia prior to the 19th century as well, and in Asia today. Yeah.
You referred to someone going from Paris to Sri Lanka. Who was that?
The Buddha,
The
yeah,
Buddha,
yeah,
okay,
right,
so
yeah. I mean, I'm
all
talking-
part
yeah,
of the exportation
yeah,
back
that,
to.
yeah, that metaphorically going, yeah, although by ship, yeah.
And Paris was the center of
Paris,
that?
I'm looking particularly at this figure called Eugène Burnouf, who wrote the kind of foundational text for the academic study of Buddhism and published in 1844 in Paris, yeah. And then he had a whole legacy of students that continue to the present day. Yeah.
I noticed that you were making the comparison between Buddhism and science and some of the analogies that were made, one of which was this belief in alternative universes.
Yeah, right.
And then alternative, are you saying that they compared to alternative six realms, or something beyond that, or different?
Yes, I was talking about multiple universes. So the universes come into existence, and each one has its own Mount Meru with the 4 continents. You know, the standard cosmology. So there are hundreds and thousands of those throughout space, and they each have their own set of hells. Although those are the same set of 8 hot hells and 8 cold hells that we find. So they're exactly similar in a certain sense. Beings are born there as a result of their karma. In fact, those worlds were created by the karma of the beings who inhabit them. But Buddhism is entirely happy with the whole multiverse idea from that perspective. Yeah.
You looked through that poem right at the end,
Yeah.
and I guess I didn't quite follow exactly, but I felt that the bulk of your talk was kind of one way, and this was sort of a contrast. I didn't
Right,
quite understand what your point was in contrast to everything before.
Yeah. So most of the talk was kind of a straight history, which I was asked to provide, of course, which I was happy to do. And it basically comes out of this book that just came out. But I also, once a book there's a kind of convention in the academy that once a book comes out, you shouldn't just talk about what's in the book because anybody can read it. And so as from the time this book came out just in November, and it looks like I'm going to have to also give my own position on this point sooner or later. So I thought I'd give a little preview of that in the last few pages today. So the last few pages of the talk. So the book itself is largely a history of this conjunction of these two terms, Buddhism and science, going back to the 1860s and 70s. But Buddhism and science, of course, is a major hot topic today. And it's something that I'm going to have to give my own views about at some point. So I just wanted to give us that preview of that. So if you notice a little break there, you were right.
So are you saying that poem was sort of giving your views of Buddhism or
Of the
Buddhism
Buddha. That's
versus
my view of the
science?
Buddha, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Right. Yes, sir.
Can we follow up on that a little
Yeah,
bit
sure.
more?
Yeah.
Because of the way that you said this Buddha was a counter-evolutionary.
Counter-evolutionary,
Could you elaborate on
Yeah,
how you
well,
meant
I mean,
that?
so, according to Buddhist doctrine, this entire world that we inhabit is the product of our own karma. The physical universe, this room, each of our bodies, all of these things are the product of our own past karma, and that karma has no beginning. And so we've all cycled through rebirth a zillion times in every possible form. It's going to go on forever unless somebody stops it. The only person who can stop it is of course, do it ourselves, but we can only do that through the Buddha's teaching. And so that from a certain perspective, the Buddha is seeking the complete extinction of sentient life and the passage of that life into nirvana, whatever nirvana means. And so he's not interested in the evolution of species, he's interested in their extinction. And that if we want to talk about all of us as a single species of sentient beings, that would be the analog. So, as you may know, the term nirvana is often translated as extinction. It's not a bad translation. And so that was my reference there. Yeah.
So you're also talking about the transition from karma to interdependence. Based on that point you were just making, could you elaborate a bit?
Well, I mean, karma and independence are completely compatible, right? So karma is one kind of, from the point of view of Madhyamaka philosophy, the kind of most simple form of interdependence. The fact that everything depends on its cause. And then interdependence becomes more sophisticated in the Guardian and his followers, and when we start talking about emptiness. And it's the emptiness idea that's sort of been paired up with quantum physics, which is one of the issues that's sort of currently of interest to people in the dialogue today. Yes, ma'am.
You've been talking about how different forms of Buddhism and different forms of
Yeah.
science sort of
Right.
appropriated each other.
Yeah.
Currently, there's this link between like neuroscience
Right.
and Buddhism.
Yeah.
Where do you see this relationship between the two going in the future?
Well, so that is, as I tried to say, that relationship is different, right? Because it's not saying this sounds like that, right? That this Buddhist doctrine sounds like this scientific whatever. It's actually saying that something goes on in the brain during meditation, and that is measurable. And I think it probably is. So when we talk about Buddhist meditation, I mean, one of the first things to say is that over the course of history, very few Buddhists have ever meditated. Our idea that all Buddhists meditate is simply false. And we know that even not all monks and nuns meditated, because we know when we read the descriptions of how you lay out a monastery, there's a special place just for the meditators. On the other hand, we have to concede that meditation is the practice kind of par excellence in Buddhism. And Buddhist monks and others have practiced meditation for over 2,000 years. And they probably would not have been doing that if it wasn't fun on some level, right? And so I think it'd be interesting to sort of discover what is that element of fun, and is that measurable neurologically? So there's a whole host of issues that we can look at once we talk about the neuroscience, one of which is, for example, what's the relationship between experience and doctrine? So that most people think that the Buddha had this experience under the tree, and his doctrine is the articulation of that experience. But you could also argue that doctrine creates experience. You study doctrine, and that somehow programs you to understand something in the meditation practice that is doctrinally based. So I think there's a lot of possibilities here. I think there's also, though, some hazards that we don't want to really just put so much faith in the fMRI. There has to be some critique of that as well, and that is yet to come forward. That's a long answer. Sorry. Yes.
Maybe you can tell us what is nowadays school science view of now the meditation effect on the brain.
What was what? Excuse me?
The school science, the scientists,
Yeah.
let's say neuroscientists, who certainly have one way or the other heard or did themselves some laboratory studies on meditation effects and what's going on there.
Yeah.
And to what extent is this, at least what one reads in the, let's say, in the general press, that's kind of somewhat proven? To what extent, for example, have the thought about using it for educational purposes, for example?
Well, there's a whole group called the Mind Life Institute, which is trying to get meditation taught in schools. There's something called MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, that's being taught in hospitals. And so some applications are being made. But it is the case that much of the research that's being done on Buddhist meditation is being done by scientists who are themselves Buddhists. And so there have been some questions about the quality of some of the studies. So in just last year, the National Institute of Health sponsored a major study of the effects of meditation, of scientific research on meditation, looking at over 800, one of these meta-analyses, they take 800 different studies and then give their analysis of what happened. Let me just read their conclusion. The field of research on meditation practices and their therapeutic applications is beset with uncertainty. The therapeutic effects of meditation practices cannot be established based on the current literature. Further research needs to be directed toward the ways in which meditation may be defined, with specific attention paid to the kinds of definitions that are created. A clear conceptual definition of meditation is required, and operational definitions should be developed. The lack of high-quality evidence highlights the need for greater care in choosing and prescribing interventions, controls, populations, and outcomes under the understudy so that research results may be compared and the effects of meditation practices eliminated with greater reliability and validity. Firm conclusions on the effects of meditation practices in healthcare cannot be drawn based on the available evidence. It's imperative that future studies on meditation practice be rigorous in design, execution, analysis, and the reporting of results. Now, it's also the case, though, that they're looking at things like the effects of meditation on substance abuse, on stress, on divorce. I mean, so there's a whole range of things that are not the typical domains and purposes of Buddhist meditation. And so this kind of disconnect between how the practice is described in the tradition and what's been used for traditionally and how it's being used in a healthcare environment is a huge issue yet to be negotiated. Yeah.
Just to build on that question, do you think science as an epistemology has constrained the development of human knowledge? Because people are still skeptical about the impact of meditation, and that's because of the preoccupation of the scientific rationality. So do you think that science is the ultimate truth? So, we need to explain everything by science.
No, I don't, but I think that's the world in which we live, right? Science provides the validation for so many things, and the fact that Buddhists are looking to the laboratory to validate their own practice is an indication of that. But I think the effects of Buddhist meditation are largely things that we read about in texts and are more difficult to measure unless one goes into this kind of setting and to, put electrodes on the head of a Buddhist monk seems so invasive and strange in so many ways, although that's being done. So we're right in the middle of this right now, so it's very hard to kind of say what's going to happen. And as you look at the kind of story I've tried to tell here, we sort of see different forms of Buddhism being lined up with science over the course of over 150 years. When we look back at these conjunctions, many of them look like forms of nonsense. We see the quack science of the theosophists trying to talk about auras. We see people claiming that karma is somehow a form of evolution. These things are simply, we now know, wrong. And so, although we have to continue with the research we're doing today, I think there's something of a lesson to be learned from looking back at the past and the ways in which these claims were made with such great certainty. And now we look back at them as rather eccentric.
Well, my second question is, I remember I've seen this documentary called The Knowledge of Healing.
The what?
The Knowledge of Healing. It's talking about Tibetan Buddhist medicine. And, it's already been proved that Tibetan Buddhist medicine has an impact on radiation exposure. So what do you think, what is the, what's preventing that the mass production of those herbs or Buddhist medicine?
I think that the claims made for Tibetan medicine have been grossly overstated, often by Tibetan doctors. I mean, people were claiming that it cured AIDS in the 90s and 80s. It was all wrong, and many people suffered because of that. So I think if Tibetan medicine really could cure cancer, it would have been done by now.
Well, my third question is, what do you think the relationship between New Age movement and Buddhism? Those Indian guru like Krishnamurti, Osho, they made themselves popular in the States in the 60s and 90s. They kind of built up their ideas on Buddhism.
Yeah, well, Krishnamurti and Osho are totally different cases, and they each have a long story, and their use of Buddhism is different. But again, it's a New Age appropriation. I agree with that, yeah.